Do do do. Waiting. All right, there we go. Hey, everybody, welcome to the Low Budget Interview Show. I'm your host, Eric Smith, and today I am talking with the author of such books as Asylum, Summer of Winters, the forthcoming To Be, and many others. Mark+allan+gunnells. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I mean, I'm not really there, but I am here.
Right, we're social distancing, keeping it safe. Now, To Be, is it coming out very, very soon?
It comes out on the 13th. So from when we're recording this, 2 days.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I think it's the day, I'm looking over my calendar, the day this is going to go up.
Okay. Yes, on February 13th, it will be available for the world.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm trying to figure out my shtick for this show. So one of the things I tried on an earlier interview was for my guests to introduce themselves to the audience. If you had to write your author bio right now as an introduction to the audience, what would it say?
Mark+allan+gunnells is a huge horror nerd and has been his entire life and will be until he goes to the grave. He's also a huge goofball and he loves to tell stories. How's that? Completely off the top of my head.
Okay, well, I guess that's pretty good. I like to put people on the spot. I might ask you what kind of tree you would be a little later.
Okay, I'll think on that.
We'll save that for later. Now, you and I met at Horror Mall on their forums, isn't that? I believe.
Yeah, that was. Seems like a lifetime ago. I'm trying to even think of the time frame of that. It was. I know when I started posting on that particular message board, I don't think I had even published anything yet. So I think yeah, because I started publishing stuff while I was posting on there. So it was at least before 2009.
Well, I was going to say, was A Layman Kind of Night your first published work?
It was. That was my first. I mean, I had published some short stories in small magazines and e-zines, but that was my first published book with the now defunct Sideshow Press. And they even had I remember they had a deal, like that book wasn't on Amazon, that was sold exclusively through the Horror Mall. There's a digital edition of it now on Amazon, but back then, like, it was a limited and it was just sold through that site. So yeah, it was the world and technology moves so fast, it seems like forever ago, but yeah. That was my first published book.
And that was 2009, right?
Yep, 2009 was when I entered the world of publishing.
Yeah, see, I thought that the Horror Mall thing was quite a bit before that, but then once I looked it up and saw the publication date for that, and I was like, yeah, it was around that time.
I met a lot of people on that site that I'm, still friends with on actually what became the new social media, which is now the old social media, but because it changes faster than I can keep up with. I did learn from some college kids I know that Facebook is for old people. I'm like, okay, well, that explains why I'm on it so much.
Yeah, I suppose. Me too. I do kind of miss we had those weekly Saturday night chats, if you remember that.
Yeah, I mean, there were things I liked about the message boards, and I sort of missed that time period. But then, as an old fogey, we're always reminiscing about all the great things from our past. I could go into video stores and stuff like that, but I'll spare everyone.
I won't. I love talking about reminiscing about those times. I mean, we we had authors and publishers and just fans like myself just getting together and talking about horror, although it always seemed to eventually become a chat about people's pets.
Although I will say the Horror Mall is how I got that first book published. I mean, sort of indirectly, I had published a short story with a magazine that Tom Moran and his wife, Billy, had produced. But then I was chatting with him on the Horror Mall, and I didn't even know it because we had like handles. So like I
Right.
wasn't on Mark Gunnells, I had some handle. But I mentioned I was a writer and told him my name, and he was like, "Hey, I published that one story of yours in my magazine." And then he asked me to send him some more stories, I thought for the magazine, because I didn't know yet that he was starting his own publishing company. And when I sent him some stories, he said, "I'm starting a publishing company. I'm starting with these chapbooks. Do you want to be one of the first 4?" And next thing I knew, I had my first book out, all because of that message board, really.
Was yours the first one in that series?
I think it was because it was me, Brian Knight, Edward Lee, and I actually have them down here. I can't remember who the 4th one was. There were 4 of us. Let's see. I have the box set still.
Oh, fancy.
And Kurt Newton. So it was
Okay.
me, Brian Knight, Kurt Newton, and Edward Lee. And yeah, mine is the first one in the set.
Fancy. Well, I have, if I turned my camera around, you would see the mess of books that I have. So I can't get to all of my books, but this one has been sort of in a place of honor because it's such a nice book. It's from Sideshow. Um, I can never pronounce the name correctly, but I love the production value and I love the fact. I'm not going to show the cover first. I'm going to show this, that it had the little personalized tombstone.
Yeah.
If how do you pronounce that title?
Sorry, Wissenot.
Just Wissenot. Okay, that's easy enough. Yeah, they put out some great books, and like I said, I just love that it had that little personalized touch to it. Apparently, I died back in 2011.
Yeah, that was my second book with them, and they had that really cool hardcover. The paperback was also cool too because it's 2 novellas, and on like when you're looking at it, you're looking at the cover for one, and then you flip it over and upside down, and it's a completely new cover for the second one. So they did some good stuff, Tom and Billy.
What was the second one on that? I don't remember.
It was Creatures of the Light.
That's right. That's right. This is number 13, by the way.
Lucky 13. That was the first time I ever had to sign author, the signature sheets.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I mean, we didn't do a lot of those. Maybe I want to say 50, but it was still. I remember it was kind of like, and it always seemed weird. I'm like, I don't know why anybody wants my signature, but okay. But yeah, those were the early days for me.
This says limited to 80 trade paperbacks and 30 deluxe hardcovers.
Okay, so there were 30 covers then. Okay.
They did not give you a big space for your signature on here.
They didn't, but they wanted it on the tombstone, which I thought was a clever idea.
Yes, yeah. And it's got illustrations. This is a really nice production. I mean, there's some great small presses right now, but I'm not able to buy as many limited editions as I used to. So I generally don't see this kind of production with those little extras the way that I used to.
It was there was like sort of that window, that bubble of time where that was really big. And like you said, there are some great small presses still, but they don't do them in quite the same way. And especially now, which I mean, it helps me as somebody on a budget, but usually you're going to have an ebook version too, which is good. But back then, like Sideshow Press didn't do any ebooks. It was just the paperbacks and the limited hardcovers. And like I said, they didn't even sell those through Amazon. They started on the horror mall and eventually were just selling them directly from their own website.
Yeah, there. Some of the small presses nowadays, they'll give you maybe little goodies, stickers and bookmarks and things, and some of them do. I've gotten a few from. I really like Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing, even though they have a very long name. Uh, but they've had signed book plates, and one of the few limited editions I've bought was they have an anthology called Tales from the Crust, and it's
Okay.
stories of pizza horror.
I remember reading about that one. Yeah.
And I was going through their website, and I had maybe 3 books in my cart, and then I saw that Tales from the Crust had a limited edition, and I dumped the 3 books out of my cart so I could get that. And it was delivered in a pizza box. It's a square hardcover, and it came with a pizza cutter, a pen, a keychain, and I think a few other things. But it was just, again, that's not something I see a lot of nowadays. Maybe I'm just shopping at the wrong small presses, but I like that kind of stuff.
There was, I can't remember the name of it, and now I don't know exactly where it is because my house is full of books. But I think it was Shock Totem. Put out a book that was sort of a homage to like 80s horror, and the book came in what looks like a VHS cassette case.
Was it Zero Lives Remaining?
That is it. Yeah.
Yep. I have that one in the case with it had some trading cards with it, and the book itself looked like a VHS tape.
Yeah, and I have it somewhere too, but like I said, my entire house is, when we bought our house, it's a smallish house, so it's just floor to rafters. It's full of books, but we even have a sign that my husband made that's out front by the door that says the book nook.
Well, yeah, just looking around this room, I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bookcases, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 piles of books.
Well, I'm in my office and it's nothing but books, but our living room is pretty much full of books too. So, it feels sort of like you walked into a bookstore when you walked into my house, except you can't buy anything. Unless you want to make me an offer for one of the books I wrote, and then we'll talk.
Excuse me. I suppose we should talk about some of the books you've written. So we talked a little bit about A Layman Kind of Night, your first book. Well, now you said in your introduction, your author bio, lifelong horror fan. So was there any question when you decided to write that you were going to write anything other than horror?
Well, the earliest things I remember writing were horror. They were kind of like Twilight Zone knockoffs because I was really big into the Twilight Zone when I was a kid. But then, like in junior high, it was all like teen angsty poetry. And then I went through like this phase where I thought I had to write a poem about every societal ill I could think of. Like AIDS babies and censorship and abuse. And I even have a homelessness. And I found a poem I wrote about gang warfare. This little white boy living in Gaffney, South Carolina. But, I don't know. I went through this phase where I just wrote these poems and put them in the drawer, but I felt like I'm doing something to help the world. So I went through that phase, and then in high school I wrote a really horrible teen angst melodrama novella that is really horrible, but at the time I didn't know it, and that was key because that one gave me the courage to like go forward with like the prose writing. But after that one, it was just because I was still reading mostly horror. I mean, my interests are varied, but horror has always been my first and truest love. So after that one, I wrote what I was calling a novel my senior year of high school called Daddy's Home, which was horror, and then it was just from there it was just off and running.
Well, who are your earliest influences?
One of my earliest influences was The Twilight Zone. I've watched a lot of the original and a lot of the 80s incarnation. And I feel like particularly when people read like my short story collections, you're going to see a lot of that influence in those stories. And then, of course, it's not original to say, but I discovered Stephen King. And what I really liked about him was he took horror out of the like gothic mansions and castles and it was just happening like down the street, and it had a real groundedness and authentic feel that I felt like really influenced me as a developing writer. And then I discovered Clive Barker, who was a huge influence on me, both for the boldness of his visions and as a gay man. When he publicly came out in the 90s, it was a big deal for me. But then I also, because I did grow up watching a lot of horror movies also have helped me in my development. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, which was like, a kind of a golden age for horror, not always necessarily good horror, but you couldn't go like a month without a new horror movie being released. And, so that had a big impact on me too.
Now, of course, I grew up loving the Twilight Zone as well. And you said you watched the show. Did you read, say, the Richard Matheson things? Any of his?
Not at that time, not when I was younger, but as I got older, and I realized, I think the first thing I ever read by him was probably I Am Legend. And then when I realized he was one of the writers of so many of the Twilight Zone episodes I loved, I started reading more and more of his stuff and a lot of his short fiction. I really like his short fiction, and so yeah, when I was young, I wasn't that aware of him, but I definitely became aware of him as I got older, and he's actually one of my favorites now.
I think I could be completely wrong about this. I think I read that he was the second most prolific writer of Twilight Zone episodes.
I would
at least
believe
the original series,
because he wrote a lot, and he wrote a lot of the ones I really like. So I feel like probably after Rod Serling, he probably was one of the most prolific on that series.
I don't remember if the Twilight Zone led me to his work or if it was just I was watching Twilight Zone and I just happened to stumble across his prose. I used to have he had a series of short story collections called Shock that I really wish I had my old copies of those. They were just those great, cool looking 70s covers, 70s and 80s covers, and had all his, I think if you had the whole series, I think it was all of his short stories at least up to that point.
I mean, I think when I first read him, I didn't even realize the Twilight Zone connection, but I went through a period in the early 90s where I was vampire crazy. So I was just reading every vampire book I could. And so, of course, I Am Legend is a classic. I read and loved that. And that was when I loved that one, I started looking up more of his stuff. And that's when I realized, like, oh, he was one of the Twilight Zone writers. And like in this short story collection, these stories were made into episodes. And I mean, they even used some of I know at least one of his stories I remember from the 80s incarnation being adapted, Button Button.
Have you read He is Legend?
I have not read that one yet, but I do have it right over here somewhere. But I have not read that one yet. But I do. I have it, and I have a couple of Bradbury tribute anthologies. But I think I'm holding off on those just because there are still some titles I haven't read by Matheson and Bradbury, and I want to, like, I don't want to read the tributes to those
Right.
stories till I read stories, if that makes sense.
I've read it. I loved it. I don't remember. I remember a few specific stories. Don't remember all of them. I think in general, I find most anthologies sort of average out. You have some really great stories, and then there's the weaker stories. I think this one, I felt the stronger stories were the majority. I think, if I recall correctly. And there's a man, I would love to talk about a couple of them, but I don't want to spoil them for you.
Yeah, no. The only one I've read so far is Throttle, the one that King and Hill wrote, because I had read Duel, and I'm like, well, I'm interested in this, collaboration father and son did. So that's the only one I've read so far.
Well, I mean, it can't really be a spoiler if I say that I absolutely love the Jeff Strand story that's in there.
Okay.
Of course, I'm a huge Strand fan, but his story is definitely one that stands out. I remember it very well.
Okay. I'll have to give that one a look.
And I would say, considering what you've said, that it is a story you've already read. The Matheson story is
Okay.
one you've already read. I think. I hate to spoil things. um, Now I do know, if I'm not mistaken, you're a huge Joe Lansdale fan.
I am. Yeah.
So what is it about Lansdale that draws you in, that makes you such a fan?
Um, One thing I think he does very well is he packs a lot of punch in a minimalist fashion. Like he really is good at, like, an economy of words. Like, he doesn't have to take, like, a whole long paragraph to get a point across. Like, he can really hit it succinctly, and there's a certain power in that I like. I think he creates great characters. I know
Absolutely.
the second Happen Leonard book, there's like a whole long section of that novel where the plot is not being propelled at all. It's basically just those two characters fixing up an old house.
Mm-hmm.
The characters are so interesting. Like, I I don't care. Like, I don't care if the plot's not moving forward. I'm interested in the conversations they're having, and I like it. He's really good with dialogue. I think it has a very authentic, naturalistic feel, and and I don't know. And again, I fell in love with him initially through his short stories. I got his collection Electric Gumbo from a used bookstore, um, and I just thought they were amazing. Like I said, his use of language, how much he could say with only a few words. And from then, I just started reading everything I could get my hands on.
Well, I've always said that he could write an entire novel of just Happen Leonard sitting at the kitchen table talking, and I would be
Yeah,
happy to read it.
yeah,
They're amazing characters. And he's one of those authors I was actually reading before I knew I was reading him, because I collected Twilight Zone magazine,
yeah,
and he had short stories in there, and I didn't, uh, to my detriment, I think I didn't pay that much attention to the authors of the stories. And it wasn't until I got some of his short story collections and reread or was reading those stories, and I'd come across one and say, "Oh, I've already read this." Check the copyright page. Oh, that's because it was in Twilight Zone magazine. But yeah, I always tend to glance over at what I'm talking about. My Joe Lansdale, all sitting there. Um, yeah, love Hap and Leonard. His like standalone novels,
Yeah.
fantastic. I have his. I dug up out of a box somewhere the Tarzan that he finished, and I have the original Dark Horse
Okay.
all four chapters of it in the original edition, I guess is the way to put it, which I thought was lost forever. I even have his. I had to go on eBay and get his Batman novel.
I have that one too. Yeah, I got that one
I
too.
had when it came out, but it was one of the things that sadly had left my collection. Do you have a excuse me? Do you have a favorite Lansdale?
Uh, I don't think I can narrow it down to one, but I mean, I love The Bottoms and A Fine Dark Line, which are to me almost like sister novels. I love one he wrote called Sunset and Sawdust.
It's one of my favorites.
And I also love the, I want to say it's more recent, but it's been several years back now, but one he wrote called Paradise Sky. Um, and his short story collections are always winners for me.
Have you read the one with his daughter? Which
Um,
I can see it, but I can't read it from here.
is that the Terror is Our Business?
Something like that. Yeah, I'm trying to.
I have
My
not read.
eyesight.
Yeah, I bought it, but I have not. I have not read that one yet. But I did buy it.
Yeah, I have not read it either. I could count off the Joe Lansdale books I have not read yet. Um, but excuse me. Back to your own work. Uh, Simple question, maybe. I don't know. Do you have a favorite of your own works?
Um, I know the cliche is that's like asking, your favorite child. Um, but I don't know because I've never published anything I'm not proud of. Like even some of the early stuff, maybe rough around the edges, and it's not up to the standard of what I might produce today, but it is the best I could do at the time, and therefore I'm proud of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I'm always partial to the short story collections, but I think I have 11, so that's not really narrowing it down. But I am such a lover of short fiction, so those are always special to me. And then there are some I like for different reasons. The Summer of Winters is one that means a lot to me because there's a lot of my actual childhood in that story, um, right down to the house I grew up in. And there's a novel I wrote called The Cult of Ocasta, which is, I feel like, probably the most ambitious book I ever wrote that had the most moving parts going on that I was trying to juggle. I think I've just mixed metaphors there, but so that one I felt proud of. I'm very, very fond of the new one, 2B, because it's an idea I've had for a long time and an idea I almost idolized to the point that I didn't know if I would ever write it because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to do it justice. But I'm so happy that it finally exists
Mm-hmm.
and it's out of my head and people are going to get to read it. And I feel like I did a good job with it. So I am very proud and fond of that one.
Now, I could be totally off base here. Wasn't the Quarry one that you? I seem to remember when you were working on it or when it was coming out, you talked about that was something that had been in your head, or am I completely off base there?
The Quarry is, I mean, that one is based around my hometown and the college that I went to. Um, the Cult of Ocasta, which I mentioned, is actually the sequel to that one. But that one, that wasn't one that was in my head for a while. But I did want to write something about I wanted to do something about the lake on the college campus, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Um, but I just started randomly researching, because the whole thing about the lake was it used to be a limestone quarry that filled in and became a lake. But it's very dangerous, and you're not allowed to swim or boat or fish in it because there are the tunnels under there that create a suction, they always said. And I thought that just sounds like something for a horror novel. But so I just started researching it and then discovering that a lot of what I thought I knew about it was just local urban legend. Like, you know, they said, they hit an underground spring and it filled up so quickly they had to just abandon all their equipment, which when I was researching it, that is not true. At a certain point, it was always in danger of filling in, and they had to constantly pump it to keep it. And then just eventually they decided to close the quarry, the limestone mine, and just let it fill in. But it made me wonder, like, everyone in Gaffney thinks they hit a spring and it filled up so fast they had to abandon their equipment. And it was when I found out that a lot of what we thought about it wasn't true that I started to get the shape of what the novel became. Because I started thinking, like, well, why do these myths exist? What are they trying to cover up? And so it snowballed from there into the novel, which I intended to be a standalone. But then several years later, I ended up writing a sequel to it.
Did that? Did you eventually come to the idea of a sequel? Did you have an idea for something that morphed into a sequel? How did that happen?
Well, the publisher of that one, of the Quarry, Evil Jester Press, my editor for that book was a fellow writer named Pete Giglio, and he just, when he was editing it for publication, he just said, you should write a sequel to this. And then I had told him I never thought of one, and he just threw out not an idea for a sequel, but he threw out a question. He said, I think this thing that happens at the end of the Quarry, could have ramifications beyond the story. And that is what made me start thinking, well, that one little question he asked, and then it just sort of, again, snowballed from there. That one little thing got me to thinking, well, what does that mean? And these connections started happening in my head, and then I realized I could do a sequel. It took me a while. I actually started one right after The Quarry came out. I got a certain point, and for some reason, I lost my momentum, and I put it aside, and I wrote a lot of other things. And then several years later, I looked back at what I had and thought, well, that's not bad. It actually is going pretty well. And then I picked it up again and finished it. So you never know. I don't think I've ever written a book with the idea that I'm going to write another one after it. And there's a lot of books I have that have small connections so that they all sort of happen in the same universe. But so far, that's the only real direct sequel I've ever written to a novel.
And yet you have a book called Sequel.
I do, which can confuse people. The sequel is not a sequel. It is a standalone book. Although sometimes I think I am going to write a sequel to sequel called Reboot. But that's just a vague notion in the back of my head. But yeah, sequel is my loving homage to the slasher films I grew up watching.
Yeah, I can't remember if I reviewed that. I know I read it. I don't know if I was reviewing on YouTube at the time. But I always enjoy that sort of being thrown into the middle of a world that doesn't really exist. But the movie that you're writing a sequel about isn't a real movie.
Yeah.
And we just have to come along for the ride.
Yep.
Actually, not to pimp someone else's work while I'm talking to you. Are you familiar with Jonathan Raab or Rob? I'm not sure how it's Raab.
I haven't read him, but I'm familiar with him. Yeah.
He has one of my favorite books I read last year was, I'm going to say, Return to Ghoul Mountain Part 6, the official novelization. So, of course, it's a novelization of a movie sequel that doesn't exist. And it's, of course, it's a sequel to a series of movies that don't exist. And it's just, and he throws in, it's kind of meta because he throws in like the whole history of the movie franchise and talks about the score that's used and the actors and the actresses. And it was very meta. It was very, you could just read the chapters that are the novelization part and have a good time reading this, again, novelization of a slasher film. But then there's all this extra, almost like the special features on a DVD. And I really enjoy that kind of thing. And that's the feeling I got from Sequel.
That was, you know, when I first got the idea for Sequel, I was in college. And it's because the college I went to in the 80s, they filmed a really cheap, really bad horror movie there. They filmed a movie called Final Exam
Familiar with it.
on the college campus. And it's a horrible movie, but I love to watch it because it's my campus, and it's fun to watch and see all the places I know and be like I had statistics in that room. And also because the college is so small, it's always funny to me that they have the characters just running back and forth and diagonal, when really if you just picked any direction and ran for a minute, you'd be off campus. But I got to thinking, because the college doesn't really like to talk about it because it's not a well revered film. But I was like, you should have plaques. You should have like, this is the building where the school slut got killed, and this is the building where the virgin had her showdown with the killer. But then I thought, wouldn't it be cool if while I'm going here, they made a sequel and they came back? But I'm like, of course, they won't make a sequel to this because it's a horrible movie that nobody watched. But I thought, well, if it had become a cult classic, and I just started thinking about, this bad movie that becomes a cult classic and they make a sequel to it, maybe somebody doesn't want the sequel made. And at the time, because this was the late 90s, it was before the Scream movies came out. So the whole meta thing didn't really exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to write it because I didn't know anything, because it was also the early period of the internet. I didn't know much about how movies were made. And oddly, what finally made me decide to write it was after I bought the DVD box set of the first 3 Scream movies. And I was listening to the audio commentaries, and I thought, I used to be obsessed with listening to audio commentaries on DVDs. And I thought, just from listening to these, I'm at least getting some idea how movies are made. And so I decided I'm just going to give it a try. And I mean, I wrote it years. I mean, it was the first novel I ever finished, but didn't get published for many, many years after that. And I published it with, it was Gallows Press, which was really Sideshow Press, but a more mass market sort of offshoot that they did, which was just paperbacks and digital on Amazon. But Tom really helped me get it shaped up because it was really rough, that first draft. And but I mean, all my love, that's why I said, growing up watching horror movies had an influence. That was just all my love of those horror movies just thrown in there. And hopefully other people who grew up with that love of those movies would enjoy it and sort of feel a connection to.
Well, it's a lot of fun. Excuse me. All right, before we move on to bigger topics, I just want to talk about Where the Dead Go to Die, which you co-wrote with Aaron Dries. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to ask about how the process of collaborating was, but specifically, did you find uh, any culture clash? Were there any cultural differences that came up while you were working together?
Not really. And oddly enough, when we were doing that, it never even occurred to me. Like the biggest thing was because he's an Australian, he lives in Australia, was our time differences are so different that when we needed to just talk things out, we had to find little windows where maybe it's late at night here, but early in the morning, something like
Right.
that. But because we were really, it was his idea to set it in America, and he's visited here a lot. I've never visited Australia, so probably a good idea. Um, but but we share a very similar love of horror. We have a lot of the same cultural references when it comes to horror. Um, we have not a similar style, because when I collaborate with someone, I'm not really looking for someone whose style matches mine, but whose approach matches mine. And we had a very similar approach to writing. And it was a very different, because I've collaborated with some other authors, but this one was a very different experience as to how we did it. Usually it's just a back and forth. I do like this chapter, you do that chapter. But this one was more a like, you do this chapter, or I'll do this chapter, and then Aaron will just go back over it. And it sort of made it more almost like a third voice in a way. But we have different strengths. He is great with like filling in details, and like I'm more of a bare bones writer. So I could give him those bare bones and then he could build on top of that. And it was a really good experience. I'm hoping, to collaborate with him again sometime in the future, because it's been, that book's a while in the past now, but we had a really good time.
So no odd slang, no hey, what is this supposed to mean? And having to change things to
No, I did. I mean, if any of that came from me, like sometimes I would write a chapter and I would tell him, I have this expression in here because I have a character who's from South Carolina. The story doesn't take place in South Carolina, but one of the major characters is from South Carolina. So I'm like, this is a phrase that's very common here. But I put it in context so you understand it in the story. But I just wanted to let you know, because it's just what somebody from here would say. Um, and he did ask me to go through, what he wrote, and since it was set in America, if anything didn't sound like something an American would say. And maybe there were a few of those, but like I said, he's been here. One time he came, he took a trip to the United States and just toured the filming locations of horror movies, which was pretty cool. So, and I met him at the World Horror Convention when it was in Atlanta, Georgia, one year. So he was pretty good about that. But no, it was a pretty smooth process, actually.
nice. Excuse me. Okay, so I want to talk about some subjects, and
Okay.
I had mentioned to you when we were setting this up that I think I mentioned it to you that I wasn't sure about bringing these things up, but they are things that you talk about a lot on social media. Um, so that's essentially diversity and representation in writing, and of course in horror writing specifically. Now, do you think there's still a problem with those things?
I think things are better than when I was younger, but that we still have a way to go. And I think one of the most telling things is that if you bring up the topic, there's some people who want to shut down the discussion. And I don't think that helps. Because, but like I said, it is getting much better. When I was growing up, every horror writer I knew who wasn't Anne Rice was a straight white man. And that's the books you saw. That's the books that were on the shelves. Um, and as a gay man who wanted to write horror, I didn't know if there was going to be a place at the table for me. Because, this was back before Clive Barker publicly came out. And I know a lot of people have since said, well, everyone in the industry knew. I wasn't in the industry. I was like a teenager in Gaffney, South Carolina, and I didn't see myself represented in the writers, and I didn't see myself represented in the characters. And that sort of thing does matter. You want to be able to see yourself in the genre you love. And I didn't. So I didn't feel like, and, for a while there, I just wrote stories about straight people because I thought that's how you had to do it. And I saw that the author, Tananarive Due, if you're familiar with her,
Mm-hmm.
she has talked about how when she started writing, she's a Black woman, but she started writing just white characters because she thought you can't write horror books with black characters because there aren't any. Luckily, we both pursued other and realized other. And that's why I said, when Clive Barker publicly came out in the 90s and then followed that up with a book, Sacrament, which was a mainstream publication from a major publisher that had a openly gay author and a gay main character, that was kind of eye-opening to me. I'm like, somebody's doing it. And I felt visible for the first time. And that's around the time I really started using gay characters. And when I first started publishing, I ran into some pushback from some editors who were concerned about me being so openly gay, who were concerned about me using prominent gay characters because they always like to talk about the heterosexual male fan base and what might make them uncomfortable. And, I would have like my word choices question, like, a a man wouldn't call another man beautiful. And I would say, well, a gay man would. And they were like, well, but straight men are going to be reading this. And that sort of thing that, sort of made me trepidatious at the beginning because I worried, is this what it's going to be like? I'm going to constantly be dealing with this. I do think, and those editors were not malicious. I think they were well-meaning, but I also think they were of a thinking that was dying out and
Mm-hmm.
that they were underestimating the sophistication of the horror audience. And luckily, shortly after that, I met publishers. Apex Publishing published my novella Asylum, which was super gay. It's like I was living dead in a gay club, but and they had no reservations, and they marketed it because that was one thing I ran into too. They kept saying, "Well, you're going to have to find a publisher that specializes in marketing only to gay people," but Apex just marketed it like any other mainstream zombie story. And, I found that those straight male readers appreciate getting a story from a perspective that's different than what they usually get. And I also feel like the idea that only straight white men are the base of horror, there's so many more of us. We just in the past didn't really give voice to it because again we weren't really represented. But I'm kind of babbling, but yeah, so I do think it's still something we have to talk about because still, I mean, if you ask somebody, name 3 best-selling gay horror writers, name 3 best-selling Black horror writers, it's going to take a little bit of thought, much more than if you say name some straight white male horror writers. I mean, even just, women are, I think, making much more of a presence known. But the average person out there, they're going to know Stephen King. They're going to know Dean Koontz. They might, know of some others. But, we're making strides, but we can't. We still have to keep pushing. And like I said, I like to I like to have discussions about these things because if there's an anthology that comes out and every single name in it is a straight white male, I'm not saying that the editor was intentionally doing that, but I don't know why they don't ask themselves, why is this? Why? And I've had some say, well, that's all that submits to me. And again, why doesn't that make you ask why that is? Because I was recently in an anthology called Hell Dark Holidays, edited by Gambino Iglesias, and he was talking about, he just got submissions by tons of women and people of color and LGBT, so he doesn't know what it is about other editors that would make them not get that, unless because I've told editors, if you're from a marginalized group that hasn't been represented, sometimes just having a line in your submission call that says, I'd love to hear from women, people of color, and LGBTQ. And then I've had people say, well, that it's not my job, it's an open submission. I'm like, it's not your job, but what could it hurt to have that there and make us feel a little more welcome? So I don't know. I just think it is an important topic to talk about. And I do think it, because I also am a big advocate for reading diversely, purposefully. Like I seek out people different than me to read. And, I'm not saying other people have to, but it's always weird to me when people get really defensive when I start talking about it and say, well, I'm only interested in a good story. I'm like, well, I am too, but I can get that from diverse writers. Or I only pick up a book if it looks interesting to me. I'm like, well, yeah, I can do that too. I can say, I want to read more books by African Americans or women and still pick books that look interesting to me. I don't know. There's a weird, it's like people put blinders on and they don't want to believe there's less representation for certain people, so they don't want to think about it. And I really feel like I've gotten off on a tangent in a soapbox, so I'm going
No, this is absolutely what I wanted here. Um, but to play devil's advocate, I think, is what I'm going to be doing here. Um, as a reader, now say I go to the bookstore, it's generally I'm going to be able to tell if a book is by a man or a woman. Of course, then you have authors like James Tiptree Jr., who was a woman. Um, so, how do you find whether it's a person of color or LGBT? Um, if
well,
you're browsing the shelves,
I mean, also in this day and age, there's a lot less browsing the shelves and a lot more online shopping.
see,
And
I'm a shelf browser.
I mean, that's why I talk about reading purposefully. Like, if I decide I want to read more about these people, in this internet age, it's not hard to find out information about writers. Um, if you are on any of my social media, you're going to know I'm a gay man. Tanana Review is very vocal about, Black representation in horror. So, you can easily find out these things online. And again, not saying other people need to do this, but I find that it actually enriches my reading because, I've had people tell me like, well, it doesn't matter because you being gay isn't going to affect the story in any way. And I say, but it does. I have a different perspective I'm bringing to it. And one of my favorite things to do as a writer is to take traditional horror tropes and themes and filter them through an LGBT lens. Because when you do that, I mean, like, one of the breakout movies from the last several years was Get Out. And, in essence, it's I don't want to say what trope in case anybody out there has somehow missed it, but it is a familiar trope, but you're getting it from a completely fresh perspective from an a creator for an audience that hasn't often been represented. So you can take something that's familiar and make it fresh again just by interjecting a perspective from a marginalized group in there. So I do think it enriches my reading. So I choose to do that. And like I said, and I'm online, I'm friends with, tons of writers. So it's easy to, see who's who, because, most writers are just very open about who they are. But I agree, if you're just in the bookstore and you're just looking at the shelves, you're not going to know. But my thing is, if you're just in a bookstore looking at the shelves, you're going to have less opportunity, especially like in horror, because not that many
absolutely.
things are going to be on the shelves. So you do have to seek those out. And that's the thing. Like, if all things were equal and you went into a bookstore and the horror section, if there was one, was very diverse, then you would read diversely naturally. But as it is, if you go into a bookstore, 9 out of 10 of those books are going to be by a straight white man. So you're not going to, not through any fault of your own, just because that's what's available in the mainstream.
Like, I do miss Borders' horror section, uh, which not incredibly diverse necessarily, but at least they had a horror section, and it was a decent size. The local Barnes and Noble, I don't know if they've all done this, now has a very tiny horror section, and they might have one copy of oh, Victor Laval. Of course, two shelves of Stephen King and a bunch of Dean Koontz and Joe Hill, and maybe one or two copies of, as we say, marginalized groups or minority groups. And
I
again,
mean,
but again, looking at the shelves, you're not going to know that. But as you say, social media, I've found so many wonderful and diverse authors, either from people talking about them on Twitter, or on Facebook, or on podcasts.
yeah.
And you think that's the way to go? People need like real readers, for lack of a better way to put it. Do you think need to be on these social media, be in these places, and keep an eye out?
Well, I mean, I just think I would never tell anyone what to do, but I think it's important, because some people have told me when I talk like that I'm being judgmental. And like, in a way I am, I'm judging what I think is important. I'm not saying you have to think it's important, but it is what I think is important. So I would like other people to do it, because as a reader myself, I love to find out about the writers I love. I love to find out about other writers. So I just naturally am drawn to that. Even if I wasn't a writer, I would be. Um, and again, like I said, the thing is, if we get to a point where there's just more diverse representation in general, it wouldn't matter as much, because if you just reach out, you're not automatically going to be getting a straight white male necessarily. And then, and there may be some people who do read diversely. I found that I wasn't, because I kept going back to the stuff I grew up on, and that was all that was available to me at the time. So I do like to seek it out. And that is, I mean, that's why we have things like, Women in Horror Month, which we're in right now,
Mm-hmm.
just to highlight them. Just, not saying that straight white men aren't doing great work, but we're saying, so are these women. Here's some names, look them up. There's been a big push, like I keep mentioning but she's just a voice for this, but she's really pushing, like, the African American writer, African American produced horror movies, things like that. And there's also been more of a push. I know I'm doing a lot for LGBT authors. Just here's some names, like, give them a read. Because there are a lot of, when I grew up and didn't know of any, now I love knowing of all these other gay horror writers out there who are doing it. And I like to think that, maybe there's some young gay teenager who wants to be a writer who might happen across one of my books and see like, oh, okay, so you can do this. You can be gay and do horror, and it's not that big a deal.
Well, to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned seeing yourself or wanting to see yourself represented in what you were reading. And this isn't perfect representation for you, but did you have a strong reaction when you read your first Happen Leonard?
I was older by then, but I appreciate it. I love reading, obviously, gay writers who are writing about things, but I also think it's important when straight writers, include us and just acknowledge we exist in a way that's not like for shock value or as a joke. And I did appreciate Joe Lansdale having, and because I grew up in the South, I know a lot of like rough and tumble kind of gay men as well, so Leonard wasn't that big a stretch for me, like, because I have heard some people say like, oh, well, he just took a straight attitude and made him gay, but I don't feel like that's what he did, because like I said, there are gay men come in a variety of shapes and sizes and attitudes too. And so I really appreciate that. And I felt like, especially in the early books, sometimes Hap and Leonard had conversations with each other, where Leonard would ask Hap like, how do you feel about the fact that you're best friends with a gay guy? And I felt like those were some very honest conversations and some very illuminating conversations. And so yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I thought that was much, I've read some books by straight writers where there's a gay character, they say they're gay at the beginning so you know it, and then that has no effect for that character has no issues with anyone for being gay. He has no libido, it seems. Those kind of annoy me, because then I feel like they're just they're using us as a gimmick.
Right.
Like, look, but I feel like Leonard in the Hap and Leonard series is a much more fleshed out character. And even though, it's first person books from Leonard, from Hap's point of view, so you're not getting as much of Leonard's personal life, but he has a sex life, he has boyfriends. I did appreciate how Lansdale handled that.
Okay. Do you have time to go a little longer?
Sure.
Okay. I enjoy reading the Mary Sue. I don't know if you're familiar with that website. And they recently had an article that basically said, I'm trying to boil it down, that you shouldn't. How did they put? I'm trying to think of how they put. You shouldn't feel obligated to support something just because it comes from, say, a marginalized group. I didn't agree with everything they had in the article, but they were saying, yeah, you want to support everybody, essentially, almost, not Nazis. Never support Nazis. But don't, if a book is bad or a movie is not well made, don't support it just because it was made by someone from the LGBT community or a person of color. Would you agree with that? Would you amend that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm very big on art is subjective. So I'm not going to pretend I like something that I don't, no matter who made it. But I'm not big on tearing it down. I might say, wasn't for me. I was telling somebody recently, if somebody asked me, should I read this book? I always say yes, even if I didn't like it, because I don't know if you're going to like it. If it looks interesting to you, read it, and then you decide. So, but no, I mean, you shouldn't. I would never say I thought something was good that I didn't think was good just because of who made it. I just feel for too much of history, the reverse has been happening, that stuff is discounted because of who made it. Stuff is dismissed because of who made it. So all I'm asking for is give it a chance. It doesn't mean you're going to like it all. And that's just the nature of art. But just give it a chance. Like I said, those early editors who thought, well, my reader are straight white males, they're not going to want to read a book about gay people. Well, you don't know. I mean, some people might have read it and didn't like it because they didn't think it was a good story. Fine. But there were a lot of people willing to give it a try. So don't discount it. Give it a shot. You might like it. You might not. Like any other book. That's all we're asking. Like any other book. Give us a try. And then decide whether you like it or not. But don't not read it just because you're like, oh, well, that person's different than me. That story's not going to connect to me. I mean, because again, I can't, she's not paying me, but has said, like, she said that Black people for years were watching movies and reading books with white characters and still somehow putting themselves in there. So, now white people can start practicing that, like watching a movie with all Black characters and still finding their way in there. And the same with LGBT. Like, I can read a book with straight characters and still find things to relate to. And it's not really that big of a jump. And I feel like people are realizing that. There was a time when it just seemed like those would be two different worlds. But I do think that people are more willing now to really to take that chance and see that, my novel 2B is a ghost story. It's about a haunting. Yeah, the main character is gay, but I feel like it's gonna appeal to people who like ghost stories. And so, me being gay, the character being gay, that plays a part in it. And it does, like I said, hopefully give it a fresh perspective. But I still think at the end of the day, it's a good, solid ghost story that I hope everybody will like, regardless.
Well, at the risk of being simplistic, obviously my life experiences as a straight white male are not the same as your life experiences as a gay white male, or the same as a person of color or any of this. But there's a human condition that we all uh, experience. And in good storytelling, it doesn't matter uh, if the character is gay or straight. I mean, it can matter to the story, but what I'm trying to say is we're all going to connect on that human level, hopefully, when we read the story.
I mean, I think that's true, and the hope, like I said, like me being a gay writer is going to give a perspective. 2B would be a different novel if a straight person wrote it, just because I have a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean straight people can't connect to it. And again, like with Asylum, I feel like some straight people appreciated the different perspective. And it can make you realize, okay, so we're not that different. So I don't know. I just think it's a big topic for me, the diversity thing, and it doesn't have to be scary. It's a good thing. It actually gives you a deeper pool to draw from, and it enriches your reading, I think.
Well, going back to Hall Dark Holidays, first of all, I love how that whole thing came together
Yeah.
on Twitter. But if I'm not mistaken, Gabino got so many submissions and so many submissions from different groups of people. Didn't he uh, he could only publish so many in his book. I believe he took a bunch and found another publisher who's going to put out another anthology of other stories that Gabino couldn't use, but he thought were worth being published. I don't remember if he said who the publisher was or what they're actually doing, but
I don't think he's announced the publisher yet, but I know it's going to come out next Christmas. But yeah, because he had so many, and some he loved, but he felt just didn't fit the theme of this one well enough. So yeah, he's gotten two anthologies out of this. Gambino's like a force of nature. He's a really cool guy, and I like working with him.
I've only read one of his books so far, Coyote Songs,
Yeah,
which I absolutely loved.
that was great.
But
I just read.
His presence on Twitter is just it's informative. It's inspiring. I've never met or interacted with the guy, but I love him.
He's a great guy, and he is. I mean, he's big on the whole diversity thing too, and he has a much more. He sometimes says, "I have a gentler approach" than he does, but some people wouldn't agree. But I love that about him, and he just calls it like it is. He puts out great work. He's looking for great work. He's a book reviewer. He just does a little bit of everything. He's my new hero.
Well, yeah. Well, I do know especially on Facebook. You always seem to try to project positivity. It's rare that I see you get a little angry um, sometimes, but you do a lot of your posts, at least a lot of the posts that I see, are about finding the good, not talking down or negatively about things, and saying, yeah, I like this, you don't have to like it. You like this, I don't have to like it, but we're still readers, we're still part of this community. And um, I like that kind of positivity. What how much does it take to get you to post one of those sort of negative comments
Just
or posts?
the thing that upsets me the most is some people would say it's politics, but it's for me when things that really aren't politics are treated as politics. Like homophobia isn't really a political issue. I mean, it's made into one because of
Right.
but it's not. Like if I don't like your homophobia, it's not. We just have different political views. I'm like, no, you're kind of a trash person.
Yes.
So racism, sexism, homophobia, I have nothing to do with that, and those things will get me very upset. But I just very much believe life is short. Why waste time on things that don't bring us joy? It's just simple thing. I'm not condemning anybody who does these things, but like I don't usually comment on things that are like, what writer does everyone else love that you hate? Or what popular movie do you think is trash? I'm like, I don't know why you would want to spend time on that. Like, what do you love? What brings you joy? And I particularly when people will post like, oh my God, I love this movie so much. And then people start going in there to tell them all the reasons why their opinion of that movie is stupid because the movie is horrible. I'm like, you can just go on by that. Like, you don't have to comment on that. I'm like, why can't you just let people love what they love? That's why I'm never like, you're never going to see me, I will not trash any writer. I don't like every book. And, I won't, like I said, I won't say I like something if I don't. But I'll also do it in a way that's respectful. And you're never going to see me on there trashing Stephanie Meyer or, um, Nicholas Sparks. That they may not be books that appeal to me, but I also think like I watch a lot of author interviews even authors I don't personally read just because I'm fascinated with how writers work. And like, I've watched interviews with Stephanie Meyer, and you know what? She's passionate about what she does. That's not going to appeal to everybody, but she's writing the stories that bring her joy. Why would I want to suggest she shouldn't be doing that? I also think it's funny when hardcore horror fans get mad that a teen romance series isn't written to appeal to hardcore horror fans. I'm like, not, my thing is, I don't have to be every book's target audience. That
Right.
doesn't upset me that that book was not written to appeal to what I want. So I'm going to focus on the ones that were. And if there are writers out there writing books that I don't like, but bring them joy, then I celebrate that. I don't have to be a fan of your book to be a fan of you doing what you love, if that makes any sense.
Well, it's kind of my reviewing philosophy, and one of the reasons I'm not on any publishers reviewers lists anymore. I used to get some review copies years ago, but I want to read what I want to read, and I want to review the books that I've enjoyed. I'm maybe they're I mean, I guess technically I'm reviewing them, but they're almost more recommendations. I don't think I review anything that I give fewer than 3 out of 5 stars, going on the Goodreads scale, because I'm trying to push. Maybe that's not the best term. I'm trying to recommend the books that I've enjoyed, and hopefully, um, people out there will find books that they love, new authors that they haven't read before. I love, again, promoting small publishers, new authors, um, and I don't need to. Well, technically, I suppose if I really don't like a book, I don't finish it. But I don't need to go and review something that I didn't enjoy. Since I'm not paid for it, no one is sending me free books. I don't have to do that. I don't have to review something and say this was horribly written. The characters are. I don't have to do any of that. I can be positive in my reviews.
I'm the same way. I don't review the books I didn't like. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with a thoughtful, critical review. I just personally have decided I just want to focus on the things that I love. Um, but my problem is, even when I look at reviews, I don't see a lot of thoughtful, critical reviews. I see people who are almost offended that they didn't like the book and suggest that author shouldn't have even bothered writing this book because I didn't like it.
Right.
And there was a book I read one time I didn't like. I saw an interview with the author who talked about how writing that book got him through a very dark and painful time in his life. And I just thought, what is my little opinion of that book compared to what that did for him?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That's just again. I don't tell other people you shouldn't write a negative review because that it's legit. But I
Right.
personally don't want to waste my time focusing on things I didn't like and would rather uplift the things that I love.
Exactly. And that's sort of my policy. Although I suppose if people want to hear my negative thoughts on things, I do have. I seem to mention this on every interview I do. I have a list of every book I've read since 1985, and so I have a series of videos on YouTube called Reading Remembrances, where I'm going over this list of every book I've read since 1985. So when I do that, I do talk about each book a little bit, and I will say, "Oh yeah, I did not like this book." I'm not reviewing them, but I am. I will like. Well, technically, if I had not reread Pet Cemetery last year, when I talked about it in Reading Remembrances, it would have been me saying, "This is one of the most boring books I have ever read. I did not like it," which was true when I originally read it. I reread it last year, and it's now one of my favorite Stephen King books. I think I was just in the wrong mood maybe when I read it the first time. So I do talk negatively a little tiny bit, but basically it's just saying, yeah, I remember not enjoying this book when I read it back in 1988.
Yeah.
But again, my reviews are going to be things that I want other people to hopefully find.
Yeah. It's a good philosophy.
And again, your perspective can change. There have been a number of books I've read once and not enjoyed, gone back and read them again at a different point in my life and found that I actually did enjoy them.
And that definitely happens. Sometimes I just wasn't mature enough. And I always give a book two chances. Like I'll start something. If I'm not feeling it and I put it aside, I'll always go back to it at a different time because sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's what I'm going through. So sometimes the second time I try it, I fall in love with it. So that's why, it's all subjective, not just from person to person, but sometimes just from our own times in our lives.
Well, that's The Great and Secret Show, Clive Barker. I started reading it and it was not getting into it. I don't even remember how far I got before I put it aside. And then sometime later, I saw the movie Jacob's Ladder. And for some reason, that kind of put me in. I was like, you know what? I want to read some Clive Barker. Picked up The Great and Secret Show, flew through it.
Yeah.
Just, I was in the right mood.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the first Dean Koontz book I ever read was Shattered. Did not like it at all. The next one I read was Watchers, which I loved. So I started reading a bunch of Dean Koontz, went back and reread Shattered, still don't like it. So, all right. Well, I think I may have kept you on here much longer than planned. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Anything you want to bring up?
Oh, I think I've babbled enough, but I'm obviously in pimp mode. Have the new book out, To Be from Valhalla Press, Valhalla Books. Um, it's a haunted apartment story. Um, it's on Amazon. Check it out, people.
Do you want to share your social medias where people can find you?
I do have a blog that I update regularly, mark+allan+gunnells&livejournal.com. I'm on Facebook, Mark Allen Gunnells. I'm on Twitter at Mark A. Gunnells. And I'm on Instagram as Make Reading Cool Again. And those are the primary places that people can find me.
All right. Well, I'm gonna do my wrap up here, and if you could just hang out for a second. Um, all right. How do I end these things? Thank you very much for being here, Mark. It was, you say rambling, I say great interview. Um, so folks out there, if you have any comments or questions, put them in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. My social media is on Twitter. I'm at Ronan5757. On Instagram, I am Eric Smith5757. That's Eric with a K, ERIKSMITH 5757. This has been the Low Budget Interview Show with Mark Allan Gunnells. And until next time, folks, read more books. And we will stop.